is something that a lot of people a lot of people that are not chess players, maybe they've learned to play it somehow, but they're not sure about all these different rules. This is something that sometimes they get confused about. So remember, you always want to have a light square in that particular position, which is bottom right, and the dark square bottom left. Sometimes you can immediately see that two players are probably beginners or below beginners because they're playing on a chessboard that is set up the other way around. So this is the first thing to know about the chessboard. And the next thing is something extremely important, which it may sound a little bit confusing, but in reality it's actually very, very simple, is that we have a chessboard notation, which is called algebraic notation, which, as you can see on this chessboard already, there's actually numbers and letters. And this is something very simple to learn but extremely important, because we're going to be using this notation for pretty much all our communication. And you can see that there's a square on the bottom left that has got letter A and the number 1. That means that that square is called A1. And all along this row, you can see the letters go from A to H, and the numbers obviously from 1 to 8. So that's how we identify each square. So for example, if you got this square here, this is a square G1, and then this square over here is a square G5, because you can see it's the column G, or the file, normally it's called file G, or column G, and the row number 5, or the rank number 5. So that's why this square is called G5. And just a couple more examples. This square over here, Andrew, what's the name of this square?
That's D7.
D7, correct, very good. And I'll give you one more. What, this square over here, what's the name?
That's F2.
F2, fantastic. So now this is pretty simple so far, but you will see when you hear chess players speak, they just mention all these names of the squares very casually, because once you get a little bit more practice, you'll be able to visualize the board in your mind, and that's very important, because remember, most of the game actually happens inside your mind. What happens on the chessboard is mostly for other people to see, is mostly for spectators. But when you think about a certain position, you want to visualize a few moves in advance, you will think within your mind. So it's very important to develop the ability to visualize the squares, but also to develop a certain feel, because there are a number of things happening very often on any of each of these squares, and you will want to develop a certain feel for that, which will happen with time. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But before we introduce pieces, it's very important that you're familiar with the chessboard. So there's an exercise that I like, and I suggest that you practice as well. Is an exercise that you want to do blindfolded, or at the very least with your eyes closed. You just want to be able to let me know which color a certain square is. So Andrew, if you're happy with that, I'm gonna test you a little bit. You cool with that?
Yeah, sure.
So what I'd like you to do is simply to close your eyes and let me know the square F2. What's the color? What's the color of the square F2?
I have to think of it.
Well, you have 50% chances, of course, but yes, you can calculate that.
I would say it's dark.
You would say it's dark, and that's correct. So that's dark. Very, very good. Well done. If you keep your eyes closed, I'm going to give you another square. What about C6? What about square C6? What's the color of C6?
I would say it's light.
It's a light square. Well done. Well done. I'll give you one more. Let's do F6.
F6, you said.
F6, yes. Foxtrot 6.
I would say it's dark.
And it's a dark square. Well done, Andrew. You got 3 out of 3. You can open your eyes now and
Amazing.
be happy about that. And for everyone who's watching the live stream or the recording, just do this exercise. Just close your eyes and just come up with a random square and ask yourself what's the color of that square, because that's an exercise that will allow you to start really getting familiar with the chessboard, which is very important because as you progress, you will then be able to treat every square in a way that will allow you not to really spend too much time on understanding the squares, but focusing on other more complex patterns. So once again, this is how we call the squares, and whenever we want to move a piece to a certain square, the way we say that is we mention the name of the piece and then the square where the piece is going. So for example, if I want to put a bishop on the e5 square, what I'm going to say is bishop e5. That's how I say that that bishop is going to that square. Or if I want to put the king to d4, I'm saying king d4. Now there's an exception, which is not really an exception, is something that we'll be covering in just a moment. Pawns are not considered pieces in chess. So every chess side has got 8 pawns and 8 pieces. So for pawns, we normally don't mention pawn. You can still say pawn, and you're not wrong, but normally, just for simplicity, we would just say the name of the square. So if you say f4, you mean pawn to f4. You don't need to say pawn, you just say f4, and that's it. There's a little bit more to the notation. We will cover that in a little bit. What we're doing now is we're going to introduce a few pieces. So Andrew, is this clear so far? So the way the chessboard works and the algebraic notation, is it clear? Do you feel a little bit more familiar? You actually managed to visualize that very well in your mind, so that's good. You feel a little bit more familiar than you were before with the chessboard?
Yeah, of course, with the field, yes, with the field.
Awesome. Yeah, so let's introduce some pieces and see how they behave, and then after that I can complete the actual rules. So we'll see how the pieces move. And before we do that, so the objective of the game, so there's one piece that is the king, and in fact let's just start with the king. So the king is considered the most valuable piece. You can't really put a value on the king, because the king is a piece that if you lose it, the game is over. Now in reality, you can't even lose a king. So if you're about to lose your king, then the game is immediately over, even before you lose your king. So remember, there's no such a thing as a chess game with a king that is not in play. The king will always be on the chessboard. There is no legal position in chess without a king for both sides. So every legal position, there will be a white king and a black king somewhere. Now the chess game is over when a king is threatened and there's no way to parry the threat. So we'll understand exactly what a threat is when we introduce other pieces, but normally pieces can attack other pieces, and that's what we call a threat. So the terms we use is usually threatening or attacking or hitting. And if a piece is hitting another piece or threatening another piece or attacking another piece, the game goes on. But if a piece is attacking a king, or if a pawn is attacking the king, then the only legal way to continue the game is to neutralize the threat. And if there is no way, then the game is over, and that's what we call checkmate. We have different ways to end the game as well, because the game can also end in a draw, but we will cover that a little bit later. For now, just think that in order to win, what you want to do is you want to create a threat to the opponent king, which is impossible to neutralize, so there is no escape for the king. and therefore the game is over. Is that clear so far?
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So the king is, once again, is considered the most valuable piece just because you can't play without a king, but at the same time you can't really do a lot of things with the king. And in fact, the king is a relatively slow piece. What the way the king moves is the king can move one square in each direction. So every time that it's your turn, you can move your king pretty much in any direction, but only one square at a time. So this move is legal, this move is legal, this move is legal, this move is not a legal move. Exactly. So let's do another quick exercise. So if your king is here, where can this king go? So this square is d3. If your king is on d3, which are the possible squares that the king can go to?
So d2 and d4.
Yeah.
C2, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
And E2, 3, and 4.
Exactly. So these are the squares that the king can go to very, very well. And let's try now something else. If I put the king here, which is e6, now close your eyes.
Okay.
So the king is on e6. Now I would suggest you close your eyes and you let me know which squares the king can go to from e6.
Okay, it can go to e5 and 7.
Yeah.
b5, 6, and 7, and f, e6 and 5, 6, and 7.
Exactly. Yes. Very good. So these are the possible moves that the king can make. And again, this is pretty simple. Now, in reality, this can create a lot of complexity when it comes to certain geometries. So what you can immediately see is that the king has got the potential to move one square at a time. So it doesn't really matter too much where the king is. It's always going to have a similar movement ability. However, let's see what happens if the king is here. So now the king is on h1. Which squares can the king go to?
The king can go to h2.
h2.
G1, and G2.
Exactly. So that's a total of 3 squares. Now normally we've seen the king can actually go to 8 different squares, but if the king is in a corner, then it's only 3 squares. And if the king is anywhere else on the side of the board, then there's going to be 5 squares. Now this is a very important concept because normally you want your pieces to be as active as possible, but the king is a little bit of an exception because the king can also be attacked. So what you normally want to do with your king is you want to keep your king safe during the beginning of the game, which we call the opening, and the middle part of the game, which we call the middle game. But often in the end game, when some pieces have already been exchanged, and we'll see a little bit later what exchanging pieces means, but basically means that have been captured, then your king is safer because there are less pieces, less enemy pieces that can possibly attack your king. And therefore, when you're late in the game, so in the end game, you usually want the king to be active towards the middle of the board. And when you're playing the opening or the middle game, you usually want the king to be secured, typically on a square on the first rank. So that's where usually the king will reside, usually in the corner, so G1 or H1 or B1 or A1. That's where the king usually wants to be when there are many pieces on the board. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have no idea why, but yeah.
Yeah, so the reason is, once again, we've seen that so the king has the ability to move to more squares when it's in the middle. Now, if you look at the middle, so no matter where the other pieces are, the central squares, they have more contact points with other squares. And we will see there are other pieces that are actually long range. We'll introduce a long range piece in just a moment. So some pieces, there are long range pieces, or even short range pieces, they can easily attack a king if the king is in the middle of the board. But if the king is near a corner, then it's harder to attack the king, because then you need to have pieces exactly in this particular position. Yeah. So this means that normally when there's a lot of pieces on the board, the king wants to stay safe. Because remember, if your king is attacked and you can't avoid the threat, then the game is over. But when you are instead in the end game, then it's so much better to be in the middle, so that you're more active, because you can't be attacked so easily, and the king instead can be an attacking piece as well. So this is for the king. We'll get back to the king maybe a little bit later. Let's get rid of the king, and let's introduce another piece, which is going to be a bishop. Now the bishop is a very interesting piece, because the bishop can only move diagonally. So this bishop, let's take this bishop for example, can move like this, like this, like this. Obviously this is along the entire diagonal, and the bishop can move as many squares as it wishes. So as you can see, the bishop can move 1 square, 2 squares, doesn't really matter, as many squares, provided that there is nothing else in between. So provided there's no other pieces, whether friendly pieces or enemy pieces, provided that there are no other pieces on the same diagonal, then the bishop can move along the entire diagonal as many squares as the bishop wants. And the thing that is interesting about a bishop, something you will realize if you close your eyes for a moment. Let's say you got a bishop on d6. Okay, so you got a bishop on d6 and you close your eye for a moment. Can you visualize the squares that this bishop can go to, assuming there is no other piece on the board?
It could go to c7.
Yeah.
Or to e8. Sorry, I forgot. Where do we start?
So the bishop is on d6.
The d6, so c7 and b8.
Yeah.
And then e5.
Yeah.
f4.
Yeah.
g3.
Yeah.
And h2.
Yes. Awesome.
And that's one diagonal.
Yeah.
And the other diagonal would be e7.
Yeah.
f8.
Yeah.
Going up and going down would be c5, b4, and a3.
Yes. Now keep your eyes closed. Well done so far.
Oh, sorry.
Keep your eyes closed. Now, what is the color of the initial square of the bishop?
It's d6.
Yeah. Which is the color?
Black.
Yes.
Dark.
Yes. Very good. Now, so we said that from d6 the bishop can go to c7, for example. What is the color of c7?
They're all dark.
They're all dark.
If it's diagonal, they can only be dark.
Exactly. So the bishop, something is very interesting about the bishop is that it's tied to the same color for the entirety of the game. So the bishop.
So would you have two per army.
Yeah, so each
So, or
side
two.
will have
So
one.
one is always black and one is always white.
Exactly. So both sides, you can open your eyes now. Both sides have got a light square bishop and a dark squared bishop. So light
Okay,
squared
and
bishop.
so I use the word army, and is that the correct word?
No. So we
No.
use you can use the word players. So you can refer to
Oh,
the
okay.
players, like both players have got certain
Okay.
bishop, or you can say each side, because it's
side. Okay,
it's
cool,
it's
yeah.
it's two sides, yeah. So, or you can say each color as well, because it's a game
Okay.
between two different colors. So you could
Okay.
say each color has got that, but normally you would say each player, or each side.
Okay.
So yes, each side will have one dark square bishop and one light squared bishop,
Yeah.
as you can see. Let's put
Yeah.
them here. So this is what each side is having in the beginning. And now something very important about the bishop is that because they only control half the board, then I mean potentially they can only access half the number of squares on the board. They work very well
Each.
together. Each, yes, each. Then they work very well together, because
Right.
that means that one bishop will cover one color and the other bishop will cover the other color. If for
Right.
any reason you lose or you exchange one bishop, now when I say exchange, we'll explain later what that means, but let's say you let your opponent capture your bishop in exchange for some other piece, then that square might actually become a little bit weak.
Right.
So if you lose this bishop, so let's
Yeah.
say, oops, let's say you've got two bishops and then you have only one. What's happening on the other on the other complex of squares is that those squares might potentially become weaker.
Right.
And we will see a little bit later when we talk about strategy. We'll see how to use these particular principles in a game.
Yeah.
Now the bishop. So if the bishop is in the middle of the board, and when we talk about center, we talk about these squares here. So this is the center of the board,
Okay.
and we can talk about the extended center. Let me use a different color. So this is the center of the board,
Yeah.
and this is the extended center, including the four squares in the middle as well. So this, when a bishop is here, how many squares can this bishop control?
8.
Okay, so this bishop here is controlling this square, this square, this square.
No, sorry. I thought you
This
were
one.
talking about how many squares in the
Yes,
in the extended
yes,
center.
I understand. So what I mean is,
So on the whole,
considering a
board,
bishop
you
that
said.
is positioned there, yeah, on the whole board, how many squares?
So that would be from one only position.
From that position, yeah.
13
Yeah. So as you can see, you got 6 here.
or
You got
14, including the one that he's in. But
yeah. So we do not count the one where the bishop is there, because
Yeah.
there can only be one
Okay.
piece in a square at any given time. So you can never have
Yeah.
two pieces at the same time. And
Okay.
therefore, if you go to a square what that is already occupied, you would just remove the other piece and capture it.
Okay. Okay.
So the way the capture works is that if you just land on a square when there's an enemy piece, then you'll just capture that piece. That's the way that the capture works in chess. So for example, if there was a knight here, I could play this and just capture the knight.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now if we've noticed that the bishop here controls 13 squares, and what happens if we put this bishop right here? How many squares does the bishop control if it's on b2?
9.
So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's not as many, so it's less squares, of course. But it's still a pretty decent number. So as you can see, the bishop, compared to the king, for example, the bishop is a long-range piece. So bishop is actually sometimes is quite happy even if it's kind of far from the center. So we've seen before the king. If the king is far from the center, it's mostly because you're protecting the king, but it's not going to be an aggressive piece. And if the king wants to get aggressive, the king needs to go to the center. The bishop can actually be aggressive even if it's far from the center, because it's a long-range piece that can control multiple squares.
Sure.
And next is the knight. So the knight is actually a piece that a lot of people struggle to understand how it actually moves.
But so it's not a horse?
No, it's not a horse. It's a knight.
Okay.
In some languages it's called horse, but not in English.
Okay.
Yeah, like you can see when someone says horse, you can be sure that they're not a chess player who studied chess. However, it's possible that some people might say horse just for fun. So.
Well, it looks like a horse.
It does. It does. It's just that.
Knight, but yeah.
Well, we're assuming that there is someone on that horse, because otherwise the horse alone wouldn't amount to much.
Okay.
But yes, and again, many languages call it horse, so it's perfectly understandable. In English, again, if someone says horse, they're either just using a funny name, horse or pony, for example.
Yeah.
So, and in any language, there's like different ways of calling it, but the official name is knight, and no one would say knight if no one would say anything else than knight if they're having a serious conversation. So the knight is actually got a different. It's actually got a slightly counterintuitive way to move, which is literally in an L-shaped form. So the knight can move 2 squares towards one direction and 1 square towards another direction. So this is the type of movement that the knight can do. So it's going to be an L shape, and it's always going to be 2 squares plus 1 square. So 2 squares toward one direction and then 1 square toward another direction. So just visually, these are all the squares that the knight can go to.
Right.
So you can see that this is where the knight can go from here. Now the interesting thing about a knight is that it's the only piece on the board that doesn't really care whether there's any other piece in between the square they're on and the square they want to go to.
Right.
So even if there were other pieces around, the knight can still go. So sometimes we can say the knight jumps. So when we talk about movements of the pieces, again, normally you would say moves, but if you want to be a little bit more vivid in your description, you can say the knight jumps, or you can call a knight move a knight jump for that particular reason, because you can imagine the knight actually jumping from one place to another rather than moving just with their feet on the ground.
So the knight, that means that the knight can have a complete range of motion only from the extended center. If it's further away, it will cut away part of the motion.
Exactly. So we've seen here that the knight here, so if you close your eyes and you imagine this knight on d4, so this knight on d4, where can this knight go to?
So it can go to either c3 or e5.
Okay, so the knight starts from d4.
Yeah.
So remember the L shape,
sorry.
yeah? The L shape.
Yeah. So, sorry, d4. So it will go to the 6th rank and then move either left or right, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to be C6.
Yeah.
Or E6.
Yeah.
Or it could move 2 ranks down, so to rank 2.
Yeah.
And then C2 and E2.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yes.
Or it could stay on rank 4, right?
Mm-hmm.
And move to B. Is that right? No. D.
Remember
So
the
it
L
stays
shape,
on-
yeah? The L shape.
So yeah, so it's 2. It stays on rank 4, so it goes either 1 down. No, wait. It stays on. So it moves 2 to the side, and it goes to B,
Mm-hmm.
and then it can go to B3 or B5, right?
So B3 and B5, that's correct.
And then on the other side, it moves 2. So it goes to F, and then again to F3 or F5.
Very good. Very good. So this is what the knight can do. Let's do one more. Let's do one more.
Okay.
So let's do.
Okay.
Let's put a knight on F6. So knight is on F6. Once again, with your eyes closed, when can the knight go from F6? In one move.
So it can go to the right. It can go to H7 or 5.
Yeah. Okay. So now, as you say that, let me know the colors of the squares as well. So H7, H5. What's the color of each of them?
So H7 should be dark.
Okay, so first of all, let's start from F6. What color is F6?
No. Wait a second. So I can't remember now. So the bottom right corner, which is H8, right? No, H1.
H1 is the bottom right if you're white, yeah? So
and that's light, right?
That's light.
Okay. So that means that every even number will be dark, and every odd number would be dark. Would be light.
Yeah.
Say. So if I'm going to the left, to the right, I'm going to. What was the starting? Was it F6?
F6, yeah, F6.
So F is a light square. F6 is a light square as well.
So F6, what's the color of F6?
No, because F is dark. Wait. F6 is dark.
F6 is dark, yeah.
Because F1 is light.
Yes.
Okay, so F6 is dark. And so the knight moves to the right to H5 and 7.
Yeah.
And H5 and 7 are both light pieces.
Light squares. Yes, correct.
Yeah.
What else? What other squares can this knight jump to?
So I can move to the left. to D5 and 7.
Mm-hmm. And what's the color of these two squares?
There. I'm tempted to say that they should be light as well.
Yeah.
But I don't have time to calculate it. Otherwise, I'm going to stay here for an hour.
How do you know you don't have time to calculate?
You don't have time to wait for me to calculate.
Yeah, so they're light as well. Yes, correct.
Yeah.
By the way, we have time because we have 2 hours in total, so we still have
Okay.
1 hour and 10 minutes.
Okay.
So we're good.
Okay.
And this is important because without this, then we can't really explain the game, right?
Sure. And then I can move upwards,
Yeah.
and so I will go to E8
Yeah.
and G8.
Yeah. And what's the color of these two squares?
So again,
So F6 is dark, we said, yeah?
F6 is dark. So G8 should be dark.
So if F6 is dark,
No. They're all light.
they're both light. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, all of them are light.
Yeah.
It can because it has to be symmetrical.
Yes, exactly. So which are the other two squares?
And the bottom squares would be E4
Yeah.
and G4.
Yeah. And what's the color?
It's light.
Light. Very good. Well done. You can open your eyes as you can see. So what can you notice about the color of these squares that the knight can jump to?
That from a dark square it can only jump to light squares, so from light squares it will only be able to jump to dark squares.
Correct. Very good. So unlike the bishop, the knight can be on a square of any color. However, they can only be on alternating squares, and which means that it takes an odd number of squares, an odd number of moves to go to a light square, and an even to go to an opposite color square, in this particular case a light square.
Yes.
And it would take an even number of moves to go
to come back to the same color.
To the same color. So every time you see a square, you will immediately get a feel of how many moves it takes, and sometimes it's even important to understand if that number is odd or even. Will not get to such an advanced point today, and not in the next few weeks, but sometimes that's important as well. Which is why, so the reason we're doing all this is because, as I said before, you have an advantage. You don't have anything to unlearn. So by doing this, we are starting with the right frame of mind from the beginning. So rather than going fast on this and then missing these crucial bits, this is actually how top players think. I shouldn't say think because now it's completely automated, but that's the type of process that goes through them.
What do you mean now it's completely automated?
No, I mean their thinking process. It's so they already know that a knight can only be on a square of a different color every move, and therefore they don't think about it because they already know that. But at some point they must have thought about that and internalized,
sure.
And therefore automated that internal awareness, that internal process, and that's how they can come up with very quick decisions and very quick moves because they already know all this stuff.
Yeah.
So another very important thing about the knight is that, so as we've seen, a knight in the extended center can control 8 squares. What happens if we put a knight on the side of the board. So if we put a knight here,
it would only be able to control 4.
Yeah, so for example, if you put it here, then we have only 6. If we put a knight here, there's only 6 squares.
Yeah.
And a knight here will only control 4 squares.
4. Yeah.
Can we do even worse than that?
Yeah, we can put it towards the corner.
Yeah, so a knight here only controls 3.
3.
And
one down, it can only control 2.
Only 2, exactly. And therefore, there is a saying in chess that is a knight on the rim is grim. Or alternatively, you can say a knight on the rim is dim. They're both good.
A knight on the rim is what?
Dim.
Dim, yeah.
So a knight on the rim is well, either grim or dim depending on how you're feeling, but it's basically the same thing. So normally you want your knights towards the center. Yeah. So this is a really important difference that we've seen with the bishops. For example, a bishop can be placed somewhere far from the center and still control a lot of squares, but a knight is really losing a lot of potential. So normally these squares here, they're not really good squares for a knight. So all this type of squares in the corner, knight is usually not very happy in this type of squares.
Yeah.
Obviously it's the same on the other side.
Yeah.
And the side of the board, if a knight is there, is usually very temporary. So if I want to move a knight from here to here, for example, then I might. What's going on? Okay. If I want to move, if I wanted to move a knight from here to here, then I would go first. I would go here and then here. So temporarily a knight might be on the rim, but usually the idea is always to relocate the knight more towards the center. Yeah. And in fact, sometimes some players might choose to do some maneuver where they put the knight on the side of the board, just hoping to have enough time to go towards the center, and the opponent might try to use that time advantage because the knight needs one more move to get back to maybe strike and attack somewhere else. So very important to understand that normally you want your knight centralized as well. So enough for knights. Now knights and bishops have a similar value. So if you consider the pawn as the unit of value, so let's say the pawn is 1, a unit of value, the value of a knight is pretty similar to the value of a bishop. So this value would be 3.
Okay.
So when we talk about value, it's just a general measure. It's not a rule of a game. It's just a strategic concept. When you have certain pieces, some pieces can control more squares than others. So we've seen that the bishop can control a certain number of squares, a knight can control a certain number of squares. So if you consider the potential of that piece, the attacking potential of that piece, it makes sense to think that different pieces have got different values. And we'll talk about the rook and the queen very soon, so we'll discover more about those pieces. But the knight and the bishop are actually pretty similar. Usually the bishop is considered slightly stronger than a knight. And the reason is because the bishop is a long-range piece, so can actually be well placed even if it's far from the center. But the bishop is limited to only one color. So the bishop is usually considered to be only slightly stronger than a knight. And it's more of a question of keeping the two bishops. So usually one bishop versus one knight, it usually really depends on the position, and we'll cover that later. But when you have two bishops, losing one bishop means you all of a sudden you're weakening one color of a square, one color complex. So usually chess players, strong chess players, would normally never give up a bishop in exchange for a knight, or we can say trade or exchange. So usually a strong chess player would normally not trade a bishop for a knight unless there is another reason to do so. Although if they do, it's probably not a major reason to lose the game immediately. So it's not like losing another piece that might be more valuable, because so the value is three units. Some people consider the bishop 3.1. Some people might consider that, so 3.25, but 3 is kind of reasonable as well. So clear so far how bishop and knights work?
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, we'll put everything together later when we introduce all the pieces. Now let's talk about the rook. Now the rook is very simple. It's probably the simplest piece. Rook can move straight direction, so can move along a file or along a rank. And the rook can move as many squares as they want. However, they cannot jump. So if there is a, for example, if there is a black pawn here, this rook cannot go to these squares because there is a pawn in the way. Okay?
Yeah.
So the rook, as you can see, the rook can, alright, so the rook can move in a very natural way, so it's very easy to foresee rook movements, much easier than knight movements, I would say, in terms of what we normally used to. And a rook, let's see how many squares can a rook control.
Always 14, wherever it is.
Exactly, so it's always 13. What we need to say as well is that the rook, so now there's no pieces on the board, but when there are other pieces, then the movement is restricted in the middle. So usually rooks in the beginning of the game, they would normally just stay on the first rank and control a certain file. Yeah? So rook.
So that means that at the beginning of a game, the rook cannot move because it's there's a piece in front of it.
So the rook.
On every.
Okay, so the beginning of the game, which we'll cover in a moment, but just as a quick anticipation. So as a first move, you cannot move a rook, but also you cannot move any other piece except the knight.
Right.
Or you can move a pawn.
Or the pawn.
Or you can move a pawn. So you can only begin a game either by moving a knight or a pawn. Yes.
I see.
As soon as either the knight or the pawn in front of rook moves, usually the knight, then the rook can join the game. So usually rooks are the last piece to join the game.
I see.
Because they start in the corner, and they're long-range pieces anyway. They're usually the last piece to join the game.
I see.
And so the value of a rook, let's just go back to this view. So the value of a rook is higher than the value of a knight and a bishop, because as we've seen, the rooks are not limited if they're far from the center. So the value is higher because
right.
and they can control 14 squares, which on average is a lot more than the bishop and the knight. So the value is higher, and historically the value has been considered 5 units, so 5 points. Right now most people realize that it's a little bit of an overestimation, so now usually people think in terms of 4.5 rather than 5. But that's the range, so just think between 5 and 4.5. That's how much a rook is worth. So normally, just as a very rough indication, very rough indication, because there's other factors as well, but 1 rook and 1 pawn equals in value 1 knight and 1 bishop. Yeah, because we say the rook is worth 5, the pawn is worth 1, and knight and bishops are worth 3.
Okay.
So if you exchange a rook and a pawn for a bishop and a knight, roughly you've got kind of the same value. Nowadays people prefer the bishop and the knight because you have 2 pieces versus 1 piece. but it really depends on many factors. But it's an exchange that you would normally consider. So you would think if you have the chance to exchange this, you can consider that and see if it's good for you.
Yeah.
And the last piece is the queen. Let's put a black queen. So the queen can move any direction, as many squares as she wants. So
Oh wow.
queen is a very powerful piece.
So it's both. So it's a rook and a bishop
yes.
at the same time.
Yes. So the queen is basically combining the range of movements of a rook and a bishop at the same time. And for that reason,
so does it mean that it has a value of 8 or something?
Good question. It's actually higher because having that range of movement in the same piece allows for even more possibilities. So the value of the queen is 9.
Okay.
The value of a queen is considered 9. That's because, yes, a queen is worth roughly 1 rook, 1 bishop, and 1 pawn.
Okay.
Which would be 9 as a value. And again, it's very straightforward, although of course in a game it's a lot of squares, so it's easy to miss some squares. But that's how straightforward that is in terms of how natural the movement is.
Yeah.
So this is the way pieces move. Now let's just see what happens with pawns. So once again, pawns are not considered pieces. There's 8 pawns per side in the beginning of the game, and pawns can move. The interesting thing about pawns is that they can move forward, but they can never move back.
Oh, I see.
So let's just take the starting position, because the reason a pawn is not considered a piece is just because it's got a very different way of operating, that it's considered just something of its own. So pawns, first of all, a pawn can only move forward, can never move back. And that's interesting because that means that pawn moves are the most committal type of moves in chess.
The most what?
Committal.
All right.
Because whenever you move a pawn, you cannot put it back.
That's it. Yeah.
So if I move the knight here, if I want to, I can move it back later. Now, it's not necessarily a good idea to put it back because the potential is more limited. But if you want to, and in fact it happens in some lines. In some lines, it's very possible that maybe I put the knight here, and then later on I put it back for some reason.
Yeah.
But a pawn, once it moves forward, can never move back. And the other thing about the pawn is that it captures in a different way than it moves.
Ah.
So this is the thing to understand. So pawn can only move forward, and it's usually 1 square with the exception of the starting square. When they're on the starting square, they can decide if they want to move 1 or 2 squares.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, how many possible pawn moves does white have?
16.
Okay, very good. So pretty much these are all possible moves. So 2 squares or 1 square, 1 square or 2 squares. So pretty much every pawn can move forward 1 or 2 squares. And every time a pawn is in its starting position, always has this option of moving 2 or 1 square. But apart from that, so in every other square, the pawn can only move 1 square at a time. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, the way the pawn captures is not by moving forward. So, for example, if we have this formation here, pushing the pawn. So, one more thing, because pawns move forward, pawn moves usually are called pushes. So, now I'm saying pushing the pawn. So from here I can push the pawn, and here I cannot push the pawn anymore. However, I can take diagonally. So the pawn always takes diagonally.
Ah.
So this is the thing to understand about a pawn, is that it moves forward, but it takes diagonally, and it's diagonally towards the opposite side of the board as well. So the pawn, again, it can never go back, so this is not a legal move. Even if there was a piece here or something, this would still not be a legal move. The pawn can only move forward, and it's straight ahead if it's free. If the square in front is free, then straight ahead, and diagonally if there is something to capture, diagonally one square forward. Make sense?
I have a question. I didn't
Yes.
understand. So if the square straight ahead of the pawn is free, does the pawn have to move there?
No, so
Or can it take the other piece?
so in chess you never have to move unless your king is in check. If your king is in check, then you have to move something to parry the threat.
No, I meant
But
because from the way you explained it now, it wasn't clear whether.
no, it's always a choice. So every move in chess is a choice, except where your king is threatened, and except when there's nothing else to move. So if you have only one legal move, then you have to make it.
Yeah.
So you can pass the move. Okay? So passing the move, it's not considered legal. You always have to make a move if you have a legal move.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a legal move, then we'll see what happens in just a moment. So for now, that's what we said. Pawn can push, and so for example, if there was something like this, then this is a legal move, this is a legal move, and this is a legal move. Okay?
Yeah.
So they're all
Yeah.
possibilities.
Yeah.
And now, so the pawns, as we said, they're considered units of value 1 because it's just a standard unit of value. As you can see, though, some pawns are more important than others. For example, the pawns that are here, they're closer to the center, so they can control central squares that are important. This pawn here, for example, can only control one square at a time rather than two squares. So this pawn here is not as valuable as a central pawn because the squares that it can control are not, it's actually not the same number of squares, it's only one square instead of two.
Yeah.
But even this pawn here, okay, this pawn here can still control two squares, but it's not central squares. So pawns that are in the center, they're controlling central squares, and pawns that are on the side, they're controlling side squares which are away from the center, and therefore there are squares that are less valuable. Because, for example, if there was a knight here, this knight wouldn't be as strong as having a knight here in the middle. Yeah. So that means that central pawns usually are a little bit more important. They're still worth one, but they're usually a little bit more important just because they can control more important squares.
Yeah.
And pawns, as we said, every time we move a pawn, we cannot move it back, and therefore moving pawns means we're weakening some squares. So for example, if I start the game with this move, which is possible, I'm immediately weakening the square here, because now this square can never be controlled again by a pawn.
Right.
And I'm weakening this square a little bit. Not too much, because there is still a pawn controlling it, but I'm still weakening this a little bit. If later on I play this move, now this square can never be controlled by a pawn again. So it's a trade-off, because as you noticed before, if you don't move your pawns, then you can't really move much. You can only move your knights. So whenever you start a game, there's a trade-off. You're going to make some pawn moves, and therefore you're weakening some squares, but you're also controlling some important squares and freeing the lines for your pieces.
Okay.
Yeah?
Cool. I just need to get some water.
Yeah, that's cool. So
But I mean, I'm gonna listen to you if you speak.
okay, that's cool. So just to clarify everything. This is the starting position, and white moves first. So this is the rule that white moves first, which
Okay.
at beginner level is not a major advantage, but at higher level it becomes a significant advantage, a little bit like serving in racket sports, for example. So
Okay.
or maybe playing local in football. Yeah, that's the type of advantage. If a football team are playing local, they have a slight advantage.
Right.
And in chess, it's kind of the same thing. So playing white is like playing local. There's a slight
Okay.
advantage.
Okay.
That's why normally players alternate colors. Now, we've covered pretty much every single piece and the way they work together. Will be more clear a bit later on. I'm gonna cover the rules, so the rules that we haven't covered yet, and then I'll see if there's any. So first of all, is there any questions so far on how the pieces work?
At the moment, no.
Yeah, good,
But
very good, very
it's
good.
all new to me, so I need to think
Absolutely.
about it properly.
Absolutely. So once again, the way the pieces move, just from the starting position, knight can be moved, or any pawns. As soon as you move a pawn, say you start with this move, which is b3, then all of a sudden the bishop, for example, could go to b2. And here the bishop is a lot more active because it's a long range piece. Normally, you start the games with center pawns, but before we cover that, there's two more rules that we need to cover, and then we need to cover how the game ends. So first of all, there is two special moves that can be played during a game, and the special move number one is what we call castling. So the act of castling, or to castle, is a special move that king and rook have when there is nothing in between and they're both on their starting position without having moved before. Let me say it again. Whenever you have your king and your rook in their starting position and they haven't moved before and there is nothing in between. So let's say we got something like this. So the rook and the king are, oops, forget that. So the rook and the king are in their starting position and nothing is in between. What you can do, so normally the king can only move one square. In this particular case, the king is allowed to move two squares, and then the rook just jump on the other side of the king and end up here. So it's a very counterintuitive move, but that's just the way it is. And the reason, I'll explain the reason in just a moment. I just want to make sure that it's clear how to do that. So this is what we call short castle. Short castle for white is when the king is on e1 and the rook is on h1 and you have nothing in between, and also the squares in between are not attacked. So if there was a bishop here, then castle wouldn't be possible because then this square would be attacked.
I see.
But assuming these squares are all free, and that includes the square of the king, by the way, so also the king needs not to be attacked in that moment.
Yeah.
So if the king is not attacked and the squares that the king needs to travel through are not attacked, then the king can just jump here in one move and the rook will be placed here, and that's only one move.
And so on the other side it would be a long castle?
Yes, so this castle that we've seen is called short castle or castle king side, because the sides of the board are called queen side and king side. So
Yeah.
first of all, the queen is always starting the game on a square of the same color.
Yeah.
So white queen starts on a light square and a black queen starts on a dark square. And therefore that side of the board, so if you divide the board in half, one side is called queen side and the other side is called king side.
Yeah.
If
and both queens will be on the queen side and
Yes.
both kings will be on the king side. Okay.
Yes, yes. So right here, white can castle long or queenside, and what's going to happen is the king always moves 2 squares. So during the castle, the king moves 2 squares. So the king will go here and the rook will go here. So this is how a long castle works.
I see. So it's not 3 squares for the king, so that it's in a symmetrical position.
Yeah, it's not. It's only 2 squares for the king.
Okay.
So as you can see, castling kingside brings the king more in the corner than castling queenside. Yeah. So usually castling kingside, unless there is a specific concentration of enemy pieces on one side of the board, everything else being equal, castling kingside is considered safer than castling queenside.
Okay.
Because normally if you castle queenside, you need one more move to move closer to the corner, whereas castling kingside, it goes straight away. Also, it takes one more move to free the rank.
The queen side, yeah.
Yeah, so to free the queen side, it takes one more move because you've got more pieces on the queen side.
Yeah.
So more often than not, players castle king side rather than queen side. And usually they castle queen side if they're playing very aggressively because they need to win at all costs, for example.
I see.
Now, the other special... Okay, so just to specify this, if a square is attacked but the king doesn't need to travel there, so say for example there is a rook here, so this square is attacked but the king doesn't need to travel there, so castle is still possible.
Okay.
Yeah, probably a bit dangerous if there is a rook there, but it's possible. Yeah.
Okay.
And the last rule that we need to cover, which again is a little bit counterintuitive, is called en passant capture, and it's something that only pawns can do. So remember, pawns can only capture diagonally.
Yeah.
So if I'm here and you play this, then I can capture like this. Make sense?
Yeah.
And this is all normal. And if I'm here and you play this, I can capture like this as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now there is a special rule that says that if the pawn is on the 5th rank if you're white, or symmetrically on the 4th rank if you're black, when the other player pushes a pawn 2 squares forward, if you want, you have the option to capture as if the pawn was moved just by 1 square. So you can capture like this, and this will just disappear. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Let's put it somewhere. Yeah.
So they have to be both on the 5th rank or on the 4th rank.
Yeah. So, but it has to be in one move. Okay. So for example, if this is the position, and black plays this, you cannot play like this. It has to be just in one move, moving the pawn up 2 squares just in one move. Okay.
Okay.
And then you have the option. However, it's an option that you have to use immediately or never again.
Okay.
So you either do that at the very next move, or you lose the right to capture en passant.
I see.
Clear so far?
Yeah.
So that's it. That's all the rules about piece movements. The last thing we need to cover is how the game ends. So the way the game ends is the most common way is by resignation. Resignation just means that a player realizes that their position is hopeless and they just tell the other player that they resign. So that's the most common way to end the game. If resignation wasn't a possibility, the reason they resign is because ultimately they know they're going to be checkmated. Checkmate means that the king is attacked, but there's no way to get out of it. For example, if the king is here, now this is not a very realistic position, but just to prove a point, this position the king is attacked, but the king can move. Okay. So it's not a big deal. Also, the check can be parried with this move, so it's not checkmate. Also, let's say, for example, if there is a if there is a queen here, then the queen could capture this bishop.
Yeah.
So there are usually three ways to parry a check: capturing the piece, interposing a piece, or just moving the king.
Yeah.
However, so that's called check, but it's not checkmate. So in this particular case, white must parry the threat, but the game goes on. Now imagine a position like this. So this position would be a checkmate. Because in this position, the king is attacked, but also the king has nowhere to go.
Yeah.
Or maybe imagine there isn't a bishop here, but there's a queen here.
Yeah.
Now, it's not checkmate because the pawn could parry. So let's remove the pawn.
Yeah.
And now it's a checkmate. Okay? Or even without the pawn here, if there's a pawn here, this is still checkmate. Actually, it's not checkmate because there's this square here. So let's put a bishop. Yeah, let's put a bishop there. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a checkmate, and when there's a checkmate, the game just ends immediately.
Yeah.
Other ways for the game to end is a draw. So a game can end in a draw. And the game can end in a draw if the same position is repeated 3 times.
Okay.
So if I play like this and then for some reason we just keep playing the same moves 3 times, whenever the same position occurs on the board 3 times, then the game is declared a draw.
Yeah.
And when we say same position, it has to be exactly the same position. So even the right to castle, the right to capture en passant, the side to move, everything needs to be the same.
Yeah.
In that case, it happens 3 times. You can claim a draw, and normally the arbiter would just check that it's true and just give you the draw.
Yeah.
Another way to end the game, which probably doesn't happen very often at beginner level, is the 50 move rule. So whenever you play 50 moves, and by the way, when we say move, it's 1 half move by white and 1 half move by black. So this is 1 move.
100 like 50 each.
Yeah, so 100 half moves.
Yeah.
Which is 50 moves. If there are 50 moves played where no pawn is captured or moved and no piece is captured, then the game is a draw.
Okay.
So that also means that it's possible. And the reason it's important, it's more because sometimes you may have a position like, for example, king and bishop versus king.
Yeah.
Now this is an immediate draw because you can already say that, okay, we're going to play for 50 moves and we're not going to get anywhere because it's actually impossible to checkmate just with a bishop. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Even if black tries to checkmate himself, it's just not going to happen.
No.
So this position is considered a theoretical draw. You just stop playing when you reach this position.
Yeah.
And that's because of the 50 move rule.
Yeah.
Now, another rule that also ends the game in a draw is the stalemate.
Yeah.
So stalemate means when one side has got no legal moves, but their king is not in check. So for example, in this position, if black is to move, black cannot go here because this square is controlled, cannot go here, cannot go here, but also black is not in check. And therefore this game is a draw.
I see.
And it doesn't matter if white has a lot more pieces, so you can have as many pieces as you want, provided that it's black to move, of course. It just doesn't matter. You know, you can put as many pieces as you want. It's just still going to be a draw because black is to move and black has no legal moves. So this is a way sometimes the way to save a game that is lost, just tricking your opponent, and maybe your opponent. Yeah, that's usually one last resort. It's very spectacular when that happens because sometimes you can really trick an opponent, and then they just have to stalemate you, and then the game is a draw. And that's pretty much it. Then of course there's other ways to end the game in a tournament. If you ran out of time, you lose the game, unless your opponent doesn't have enough material to checkmate you. In that case, it's a draw. So for example,
can you repeat this?
Yeah, so if you run out of time, you lose the game immediately. Because normally in a tournament you have a clock, and each player has got a certain amount of time to think.
I see.
And whenever a player makes a move, they push the clock, and the other timer starts running.
Right.
And if one of the two players is, of course, it's always going to be one before the other. So one player will run out of time, then that player loses the game immediately, unless the opponent doesn't have enough material to checkmate. So for example, let's say I am white here, and I've got a very promising position. So this is going to be an easy win because I just have so many more pieces. Yeah. But let's say I'm white and I run out of time. So here I don't lose the game is a draw. And the reason is because black didn't have enough material to checkmate me anyway.
Yeah, I see.
But if black has a pawn here, for example, or anywhere, doesn't really matter, then it's a loss. Because in theory, you could just blunder all your pieces and then get checkmated. Because something very important that we haven't mentioned yet about the pawn is that when the pawn, and it's really the last piece that we need to add, when the pawn reaches the other side of the board, it actually has to be converted to a different piece except the king, a different piece of the same color except the king. So if this guy keeps moving and then captures here and then captures here, you see what happens here? Now I have to choose one piece.
Among those four?
Yeah, because these are so any piece,
that's the only option.
any piece except the king. Yeah.
Okay, so you could have two queens?
Yeah, you could have, in theory, you could have 9 queens on the board.
Oh, I see.
And sometimes when you have a game with multiple queens on the board, then it's very spectacular. Usually it doesn't last very long because then checkmates become very possible, but
easier, right?
Yeah, but it's very interesting when that happens. So that's another reason why I usually want to push your pawns forward.
Okay, I see.
Because if you manage to reach the end, then it usually becomes a queen, because the queen is the most powerful piece. In some very special situations, you might prefer a different piece than a queen. But let's say 99, probably more than 99% of the time, maybe 99.9% of the time, you prefer to have a queen.
I see.
So this sums up all the different ways to end the game, and this is all the piece movement. We're gonna talk. We have a few more minutes, so we might talk a little bit about strategy. Do you have any questions so far?
No, I mean, yeah, I've listened carefully. I think I will forget tomorrow, but yeah.
It's okay. So if you forget, just do the exercise again. Just close your eyes and think about the color. The color of the square. It's a very good way to keep your brain trained, and then the more chess games you see, the easier it will become as well.
Sure.
So let's just cover some basic principles, just some very quick basic strategic principles. Whenever you start a game, a very good policy is first of all to move a central pawn. It's not the only way, but it's definitely a very good way. Moving a central pawn, because then you open up different pieces. Yeah. So right now this bishop cannot move and this queen cannot move. By moving this, you allow these pieces to actually move, and you're also controlling some central squares, which is important.
Yeah.
And here, for example, black might respond. Oops. Not this. Black might respond. Let's do this. Yeah. So after this, black may respond like this,
Yeah.
which basically they're doing something kind of symmetrical. Once again, opening up the lines and so on. And a general rule of thumb is develop knights before bishops. And it's not a must, of course. It's fine to develop bishops before, but in general, the knight. So this knight here, usually you already know that this knight wants to go here because it's the most the square that is the closest to the center. Whereas this bishop, you still want to have the options open. You still don't know where you want to go. And this is a very common way to start the game.
Yeah.
So after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, white with knight f3 just attack this pawn here. And black is developing a knight and defending the pawn. And a common move here, for example, is bishop b5, and this is called the Ruy Lopez. It's an opening that was popularized by a Spanish bishop in the
Spanish bishop.
Yeah, in the 16th century.
And how is it called? What's the Lopez?
Ruy Lopez.
Ruy
Yeah.
Lopez.
So this opening was, what was played, popularized in the 16th century by the Spanish bishop called Ruy Lopez.
Yeah.
And it's still played today. So it's still a very common opening today after almost 500 years. Yeah.
Well,
and then there's an alternative here, for example, playing the bishop here to put some pressure on this weak spot. That's called the Italian game.
okay.
So the Ruy Lopez is also called the Spanish game. And this move, bishop c4, in this position is called Gioco Piano, or the Italian game. That was popularized by Italian players in the 17th century, so about a century later. And once again, still very common nowadays. There are other ways to play. They are considered hyper modern, but we will not cover all these little details here. Now, what's important to understand is that in the opening, normally what you want to do is just castle as quickly as possible. So develop your pieces as quickly as possible. Don't move the same piece twice.
No.
And so for example, let's say we have this position here. Now, a reasonable move could be this and this. Now, I'm not explaining all the details because then it could take years to explain all the complications of this. But right now, you see, let's say both players are developing the piece as quickly as possible, and then maybe both players will castle. And development is complete when the rooks are connected. So here, after this, I'm just playing some moves that are kind of reasonable.
Yeah.
So these are all reasonable moves, and then let's say this is played and this is played, and now the rooks are connected. So in this type of position, you could say that development is complete.
In what sense? So the rooks are connected. What does it mean?
They defend each other.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically, when you start the game, you have all these pieces on the back rank.
Yeah.
But as you progress, you don't want to have pieces on the back rank, with the exception of the king, because you want the king to be safe, and the rooks, because as we've seen, the rooks, what this rook wants to do is really just to have an open file. So in the future, this rook will want to do something like this. Let's play some random moves. In the future, this rook will want to just open that. So I'm going to play this because this pawn otherwise cannot move. We'll cover this maybe in another session. But as you can see here, for example, this move is illegal because this bishop would otherwise threaten the king.
Yeah.
So moving the f pawn in this position is illegal. So let's say white plays this and black plays something else, something like this, for example. White what this rook would like is really to open this file. Yeah.
I see.
So now this file is open, and this rook is a little bit happier. You don't even need to go there. Just even if you take with the bishop, then this rook has got more potential. So ideally,
Yeah.
knights want to be towards the center. Bishops, it depends. They can be closer to the center, but not as close as the knights. And the rooks want to be on the first rank, just controlling from distance, and opening up files. So these are general opening principles. Bring your king to safety. Don't move the same piece twice, because otherwise you will waste time to develop the other pieces.
Yeah.
And obviously don't lose material. So material is very important. If you're down in material for nothing else in exchange, which is called compensation. So if you're down in material, you have no compensation, then you're probably going to lose the game.
Okay.
So at grandmaster level, not just at grandmaster level, even at average player level, if you lose a piece, you're probably resigning the game. So let's say, for example, I don't know, if I do this, and for any reason I happen to just play something like this. Let's say I mouse slip, yeah? So let's say my mouse just slips, and I put the knight here, and my opponent takes the knight. Normally I would just resign the game on the spot here.
Really?
Yeah. Because
Why?
Because when there are players of a certain level, having one piece more without any other type of compensation, then the advantage is just overwhelming.
I see.
If it's a blitz game, maybe I will play on, just hoping that my opponent will make the same type of mistake.
Right.
So if it's a blitz game, say we only have a couple of seconds per move, anything can happen. Some player might just blunder. But in a standard game, playing down a piece normally is just immediate resignation.
Alright.
So the concept of compensation is something a little bit vague, but sometimes you can have other factors. For example, if you're down a piece, but your opponent has got a king that is weak. So let's say, for example, that, okay, I lose a piece, but the opponent's king ends up somehow in the middle. So let's refresh this. So let's say I lose a piece, but what happens is that somehow, let's just say my opponent's king just somehow ends up somewhere here. Then I'm thinking, okay, this is, let's say something like this, very unlikely position, but just to prove a point, I'm thinking, okay, I'm down a piece, but my opponent's king is very exposed, so I might have some form of compensation. I can launch an attack, and maybe I can still win the game. Yeah. So in this position, then I wouldn't resign, because I'm saying, okay, I have some chances to attack. But with the king here, then I would just resign.
Okay.
Yeah. So that means that winning material is very important, and there's many ways to win material, which we will not cover everything today. Actually, let's just cover a couple of basic ways. Let's just cover a couple of basic ways to do that. So one way, let's clear the board once again. So one way to win material, for example, is to fork. Now let's do something different. Let's do this. Okay, so if we are in a situation like this, and I have a pawn, and my opponent's got a knight and a bishop, by pushing the pawn here, I am forking, meaning I'm attacking two pieces at the same time.
Yeah. So
And therefore,
the black can only move one.
black can only move one, and therefore I'm gonna take the other one. Yeah.
Yeah.
After black moves. So that's an example of how to win pieces.
Yeah.
And a fork can also be pulled by a knight. So let's say you have a rook here, and a king here,
Yeah.
and the knight here. Knight can jump here and fork the king
Yeah.
and the rook. So this is called either a double attack or a fork. Yeah. So
Okay.
forking these two two pieces. So what's going to happen is black is forced to move the king. So of course, when a knight is checking the king, black is forced to move the king because it's impossible to interpose pieces. Or of course, black could also capture the knight if there's a way.
Yeah.
But it's impossible to interpose pieces between a knight and a king. So let's say the king moves and then white can capture the rook. So that's also another type of fork. Another type of fork is, for example, with the queen. In this position,
Yeah.
I can play check here, and I'm forking the king and the rook. Black is forced to move the king, and the next move I'll just take the rook.
They're all black.
Yeah, so I'm white. Okay, let's say my king is somewhere here, okay?
Yeah.
And we actually don't need this. Okay, so it's my turn, and I play check here.
Is that the white queen?
Yeah, that's a white queen.
Okay, it looks black on my screen.
Okay, no, it's white.
Okay.
Let's put it here. Maybe it's clear, like this. So if I do this, I'm attacking the king and the rook, and therefore it's a fork as well.
Yeah. I see. Can I see the black queen? Ah, yes, of course, yes. Yeah. Very different. Yeah. Cool.
So this is one way to win material. It's not the only way.
Yeah.
I'm gonna show one more way to win material, and this is called a skewer. So in this position here,
Yeah.
white can win on the spot by playing this move here. And this is called skewer because here this is not a double attack because I'm only attacking the king.
Yeah.
But I'm forcing the king to move, and no matter where the king goes, next move I'm gonna capture the rook here.
Yeah, I see.
Now if the rook was here, then it's not that simple because then the
No,
king
because
can
the
go
king
here,
could protect the rook.
and the king is still protecting, and because the queen is worth more, then I don't want to just take.
Yeah.
In fact, if I take here, then the game is a draw. We will not go into details because then there is king and pawn versus king, and it's very complicated. But if I capture there, then the game is an immediate draw.
Yeah.
But if the king is, if the rook is here, then this ends the game immediately because, well, it's not checkmate yet, but black will resign because it's losing the last piece, and then it becomes
Of course.
it becomes a trivial finish.
Of course.
And this can happen on a line as well. So first of all, it could have been a bishop as well, of course. So it could have been a bishop doing this, same thing.
Yeah.
In case of a bishop, even this is something you would consider because remember, rook is worth more than a bishop. So even if the king can recapture, then it's still winning material.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I'm going to show is a rook can also skewer. So let's say there is a queen here and a rook here. I can play check. King has to move, and the rook will take. And the queen is worth more than a rook. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've seen double attack. We've seen the skewer. There's a few more ways to win material, but we'll not cover all of them. We have about 10 minutes left. So my question is there anything in particular that would be useful at this stage? Maybe just to rest, or maybe you want to see me play a game so you see how.
Yeah, I'd love to see you play a game. Yeah.
Yeah. So should I play a fast game? So it depends on the time. So
Play something. Yeah, play something.
Okay, so I can play. So we have about 10 minutes left. If you want to stay a little longer, it's fine with me. Then I can play a longer game, and then I can explain a bit more. Or if you
How
want
long?
to, if it be maybe a 20-minute game.
let's play a
If you want,
fast game.
okay. So if,
because I think I have a lot in my mind already.
yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna play a fast game. I'm gonna find an opponent online, and I'm gonna play a fast game. And
Okay, so you're playing live.
yeah, I'll play live, and I'll be humiliated publicly.
No, why?
But,
You're a master.
I'm gonna. I'm not a master, but I mean, yeah, I can play some master. But let's see who's. Let's see if there is any player online that would accept some challenge. If we don't find a player, I'll just play against the computer for a few minutes.
Okay, yeah.
But
I was gonna ask you.
yeah, let's give it a couple of minutes just to see if there's any player.
So you would meet real people, yeah, on this website.
Yeah, you can play against.
Chess.com.
Yeah.
And does it rank you?
There is an internal ranking system, yeah. So it's not
Yeah.
it's not the official from the federation one, but it's
No.
because that's only face to face. But it's a ranking system in the web on the website, yeah.
I see.
Okay, so
So
let
you
me.
would play against somebody who is your rank more or less.
Potentially, usually, but then it's up to me. I can challenge weaker players, or I can just leave an open challenge and see whoever accepts.
I see.
So let's see. I think it's this one here. Okay. So let's. Okay, I'm gonna play unrated. See if someone wants to play. And I'm gonna propose 5 minutes. Okay. So we have a game against a pretty good opponent. Can you see the board well?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I play d4 and he's going d6, which means that he's kind of, waiting here, opening up the line for the bishop and controlling the e4 square. So now it's not letting me put a piece. It's not letting me put a pawn on e4. So what I'm doing now, I'm playing. So this is called the Dutch defense Leningrad system. This is just the name of this defense.
Okay.
So this is
How did you recognize it so quickly?
Just because that's the definition of this defense. They're playing with f5. Now this f5 move is usually a bit dangerous, very risky. So he's playing very aggressively this game. I mean, he doesn't even know that I'm streaming. But if he knew, he would play even more aggressively. Because obviously,
really?
I'm a little bit at disadvantage because I am kind of talking while I play. But it's fun. No, I'm concentrating as well. So here you see this diagonal is very weak. So that's why he moved the king. And that's the drawback of f5. The advantage is that it's got a good control of this square here. So I'm gonna play c4 and just achieve control here now. So he's preparing this move here. Therefore, I'm gonna do some prophylaxis, which is I'm just gonna move out of the way and just let him do whatever he wants to do there. So I'm now leaving this here, and if he pushes, I'm gonna retreat my knight. I can even push myself if I want to. In fact, I actually don't need to push here. I'm gonna play a3 here, which is a useful move, and wait to see if he's taking or if he's pushing. He's pushing, so I'm gonna retreat the knight. So now he's got an advantage on the king side, so he's gonna try and checkmate my king, and I have an advantage on the queen side. Basically, I'm gonna attack on this side of the board. My bishop is pointing there, and my pieces are also in that direction as well. So here I'm gonna play this first. So what I'm doing now, I'm preparing to attack along the c file, and I'm gonna play c4 at some point. So at some point I'm gonna play c5 rather, so pawn from c4 to c5, and I'm now preparing that. So I'm playing all these sort of moves, basically, and centralizing my pieces and getting ready to attack on this side of the board. And meanwhile, he will try to play f4 at some point. He still needs some preparation, probably moving the knight. So now he's trying to achieve a stable pawn structure, and I could go c5 here, and then if he pushes, then my break would be b5. So maybe I'll just prepare with a4. So what I want to do, I just want to keep pushing pawns to create weaknesses. So now he's doing this, and I'm kind of okay with that. I'm going to close the position. So now the center is pretty locked, but I have this pawn break here, b5. So he's now going to try to defend against that. Maybe he's going to play a6, or maybe he's going to ignore that and just try to checkmate me faster, which is what he's trying to do now. So he's played g5. He wants to play f4, or in some lines maybe even g4, just trying to basically open up my king. And meanwhile here I want to be faster, just want to push my pawns and create weaknesses in his pawn structure. So now he's retreating the knight. That's because now he can play f4, because now the rook is supporting this push. And now he wants to play here. He's got two options. He probably wants to play, he can either take or play f3, so I need to make sure that I'm not getting checkmated. So I could play rook e1 for example, and just retreat my bishop if he pushes. So that's one thing that I would consider. So this is a very sharp type of game. Very sharp type of game, because that's a game where we're attacking on opposite sides. So that's a very risky way to play for both of us, actually.
I see.
And now again, we are both, like, I'm creating a lot of weaknesses here, and he's trying to checkmate me. That's basically what's happening. And the game can easily go either way. I'm starting to be a little bit low on time as well. So I only have, he's got 3 minutes left. I got 2 minutes left.
I see.
And you can also see you can see from the rating, he's also a pretty strong opponent. This is my rating, that's his rating, so it's higher rated.
I can't see the ratings.
You can't?
Can you read them? No.
Oh, okay. So it's well, he's just higher rating. And now I have to be very careful on this square here. So now the game is extremely sharp, very dangerous. Like, it could easily go either way. So my position is actually good. However, he's trying to checkmate me, which means that it's easier for me to make a mistake. And I'm also shorter on time. So basically, he's a little bit speculating on time. And I'm gonna play queen here, so I'm attacking this a6 pawn. I need to play very fast now because his attack is coming. No, I mean I'll still talk. Just gonna take here and hope that I don't get checkmated, which is probably happening.
Can't you take that rook upstairs there?
But then I lose the queen because he can take my queen. So
okay.
What I need is something a little bit faster, which, yeah, so my knights are actually still kind of far from the action. I'm gonna retreat this knight just to have some more defense on this f3 square, because this f3 is very weak now. And then my rook can here go to b1 and then b8, and so here I could take and open up everything. I could try to close the position, but it's probably not gonna work, and I have to play fast as well. So I'm gonna play this. I'm just trying to close the position. So instead of taking this pawn, I prefer to leave it on the board. It's gonna be a little bit of a shield for my king, and I'm probably gonna lose on time anyway, but It's okay. It's mostly instructional, and it's not a rated game, so it doesn't really matter.
Okay.
It's mostly for instructional value. So yeah, this type of position, I have a long-term advantage here because I have a protected pawn. So my position is actually very strong in that sense, but at the same time, I'm very short on time and my king is weak. So
Yeah.
it is a very difficult position to play, but it's still interesting. Okay, so now he's trying to penetrate here somehow. Yeah, so yeah, so I'm gonna lose on time in a few seconds, so it's okay. But so this is the concept of the game anyway. So
Yeah.
so the concept of the game is that this type of game is very sharp. It's like a race. So we are playing, and okay, so now, okay, I've just lost on time now. So he still has some time, and I don't. So I've lost. But if you look at the final position, so for example, we can look
Yeah.
at the final position, and let me see. Let me move this a little bit.
So can you replay the game?
Yeah, so now what you normally do in a game is you want to kind of analyze the game, yeah? So, and this bar you see here, this is a computer evaluation. It's not always accurate, but sometimes it can be. So after a game, you can go through the game. If I find the window, this one here, okay? And just see, okay, so these are the moves that we played. And so that, once again, I could spend as long as I want just to discuss why I've played every single one of these moves. But the concept is now it's a fight for the center and to develop pieces. So they're all pretty...
What's the bar doing? What's the bar on the left doing?
The bar is basically the computer saying who the computer believes has got the advantage.
Oh, I see.
So it's not always very accurate, but it's an evaluation. So
Yeah.
up to this position, computer is saying that white is slightly better, which is normal because white starts, and also because black is playing very risky with f5. So he's not worried about that because it's a strategy.
Yeah.
Because if you want to win, especially with black, you gotta take risks.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So is that bar also visible when you
No.
during gameplay?
No. This is something that I'm doing now. Actually, I could even hide the bar because it's a distraction, really.
No, for me it's interesting.
Yeah, it's just so this is how the game proceeded. As I said, it's kind of a race. So now the computer says this is pretty balanced in terms of chances, and up to here still pretty balanced, and here white starts having a good advantage. So now slightly better for white, and after this white is significantly better. So okay, so now in a normal game with enough time to think, like this move here would be very close to winning, because now he cannot defend this pawn here, you see.
Right.
So this bishop is controlling this square,
Yeah.
so he can't play rook here to defend the pawn, and there is no other way to defend the pawn. And if he pushes the pawn, then this pawn becomes weak. It's not lost. Well, it is lost effectively, yeah, because then it's only defended by one piece and attacked by the knight and the pawn, yeah. So yeah, after this move, in theory, white is completely winning. But I didn't play that move. I played something else which loses my advantage. So now it's balanced again. And yeah, the game continues like that. So again, a6 is good. So again, I've got the advantage here. And here, yeah, okay. So here I thought about that, but I didn't do it because this is something that actually takes time to think. So here, this move would have been a very strong move, but here I'm sacrificing a piece. So this is a piece sacrifice, and normally if you sacrifice a piece, you have to think carefully. The reason this is strong is because now I've got two very strong pawns. So if he doesn't do anything here, then this pawn is taking here and then promoting to queen, or he has to lose a rook to avoid the promotion. And if he takes, then the other pawn moves forward. Yeah? So in a game with more time on the clock, then you could calculate that. But in a fast game, it's very dangerous just to sacrifice a piece for nothing. So I played this, and again the game is balanced now. And then play like that, and still kind of balanced. And now this move is a mistake because I needed my queen back there to defend. Here I think I only had a few seconds on the clock, so I was kind of playing fast moves, and here his attack is already becoming quite strong. After takes, then it's a difficult position to defend for white. This move is not the best because after h4, which is the best, now it's balanced again. So as you can see, when a game is very fast with only a couple of seconds per move, there can be a lot of mistakes, even a good level. So here, normally a 5-minute game is not the highest quality, but it's still good quality, and if it's very, very top players playing, then it's still very high quality. So here I'm actually better in this position, and now it's a draw again. And here, yeah, and here, okay, this move I think is the last. Yes, I play one or two more moves. Now this position is lost for white because black has got enough attack here. Yeah, so this was the final position of the game. Cool. I mean, I know there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on during a game, and it's hard to explain everything and to understand everything, but it gives you a bit of an idea of how a game would look like a real game between two players. So that's a standard type of game when the player decides to play aggressively and attack the king, and the other player plays on the other side, on the queen side, and then it's a race. So that type of game is considered a race. The player that gets there first will normally win.
I see.
Yeah, so this concludes the session today. Thank you, Andrew, for being here. There's a couple of people that are on Facebook, so for whoever watched on Facebook, thank you for that as well. And that's it. So hope you enjoyed the session.
Thanks for the class, Dan.
Big pleasure.
Very kind of you.
Big
Very
pleasure.
kind of you to put your
And I will be streaming chess regularly, so if you want to watch more, I'll let you know how to watch that. So
yes,
I'll
please let me know.
yeah, it will be basically me just so the thing that we just did, it would be me doing the same thing, so just making moves and talking and
Okay, cool.
kind of explaining what like my thought process, but also maybe giving some instructional pointers and so on.
Cool. Thank you
Right,
so much.
have a great evening.
See you later.
Thank you. Bye bye.